Okay, I want to talk now about a particular type of question in journalism. You could call it the funnel question. You could call it a summary question. First of all, summarizing is a mental skill. It's an important mental skill. Summarizing has intellectual power. When you summarize, you see connections, relationships, patterns, essence that others don't. And there's a sense that summarizing is an act of creation, that it synthesizes information and creates a new perspective. You're completing the thought that somebody else has started. You're bringing all the pieces together. And when you do that well, when you summarize well, you have a power over material. Your summary as a new perspective on the existing information is a way of seeing that can dominate others and can dominate how others see a situation. And it's about the power to think. It's about the power to create. It's a type of creation that is not making something that has existed, has not existed before out of nothing. And that's what we think of fiction. This type of creation is creating the clarity that nobody else has had before. And the clarity is not there until you create it. Now, summarizing is not making information more complex. It's about seeing the simplicity in information, and that is its power. It's seeing the essence of a situation, and that's its power. It's like when we talk about photography, and there's a word for photography that's similar to summarizing. It's called sampling or summarizing with the camera. And what that means is that when you take a still photo, you are catching one moment and one slice of the visible universe at that moment. And the idea in photojournalism or in sampling is catching the definitive moment, the most powerful moment. So in photojournalism, sampling, you are catching the essential moment in space and time that represents everything else in a more powerful way. And so that's kind of analogous to what print journalists do. Consequently, when you summarize information as a journalist, when you do it well, you become more powerful. You are seeing the essence that others don't see. And then what you see dominates and becomes what others see through you. And that can happen both in words and a photo. It's like finding the Gestalt moment when everything becomes simple and clear. And the simplicity and the clarity that you have created out of chaos now dominates. So a summary is a short version of the essence of an event or of a piece of information. It filters and funnels information to make the information quick and easy to understand. It is an intellectual tool that helps understand things. It is a time-saving device. You summarize something in a photo, or you summarize something in print that saves people a lot of time. So for example, you cover a municipal council meeting as a journalist. The meeting might be 90 minutes. The meeting might be 2 hours. These days, of course, people can watch a video of the entire council meeting, but watching the video, they might not understand what is happening because they might not understand the context. And if they have a choice between an online newspaper account that summarizes the most important aspects of the council meeting in context with all the facts that they can read in 10 minutes, why not read that? Why not pay a journalist to do that intellectual labor for you instead of you as the viewer sitting through a 90-minute video and still not quite understanding what happened. So, the summary is a time-saving device. It's powerful because it controls information, it controls perception, it controls interpretation. That makes it a very a useful intellectual ability in journalists, worth paying journalists for. And so there are those who have this ability to summarize and this consciousness that others don't have. Sometimes it's not that easy to do. It's not that easy to learn. Once you learn it as a format in writing as a journalist, once you have learned it, it becomes easy to do, but it can take you time. The summary overcomes a big problem in communication. One of the biggest problems in communication and communicating with people in general is that they don't know how to summarize. When you ask them what happened or what's the matter, they tell you a long story in sequence. And it's only when you get to the end of listening to what they're telling you that you can figure out what it's about. The summary is an effective way of thinking and communicating and managing relationships through this ability to get to the message quickly and to be able to summarize the essence. So you probably know what I meant. You probably know somebody in your life who gives long, winding narratives that don't get to the point. And you might want to think about yourself. When you are communicating, do you do that? When you're communicating with a message to give to somebody, do you start with a long, winding narrative, or do you get right to the point? or how often have you been in a situation when you're confused about what happened? You're confused about the point of it all. It's not clear in your mind what the issues are. It's not clear, what you should be summarizing. There's that mental work you have to do of perceiving what happened and being able to grasp the essence of it. So in a summary, you're answering the question, what's the point? What's the point? What's important about what happened? And when you ask questions professionally, that could be as a journalist or as a lawyer or as a police investigator or as a therapist, when you're asking questions in a professional setting, you're trying to prompt a summary in somebody, and that person may not be very good at summarizing things. And so you can be in an interview with somebody and be frustrated that your questions aren't producing the clarity and the essence that you want. And it's partly because you're the one responsible for the summary. It's really nice if you interview somebody and that person can summarize things concisely, but that doesn't always happen as a journalist. And if you're dealing with somebody who's not good at summarizing or gives long, winding narratives, then you have to deal with that. If you're in a broadcast journalism situation, you're doing a radio show, you're doing a TV show, particularly if it's live, this becomes a bigger problem. That is, when you're interviewing somebody live in radio and TV, how do you get that person to focus? How do you stop that person from rambling? How do you stop that person from digressing? Sometimes the digression or the irrelevant answer is a deliberate tactic in the person you're interviewing to avoid the question and to avoid the issues. And it's become a political art, what's called the art of the pivot, which you often see around election times. So, in you could be watching a live interview on TV. It could be a candidates debate. Maybe a journalist is the moderator. The journalist moderator asks a specific question, but the politician pivots. The politician spins into a digression, which wasn't what was asked. It doesn't answer the question. And sometimes, in the art of the pivot, the person who's been asked a question he or she doesn't want to answer pivots and attacks an opponent, or pivots and attacks the journalist, which is what we saw when we watched the interview between Piers Morgan and the actor Robert Blake. And Blake was often pivoting, and in some of those cases, he was attacking the police. Some of the cases, he was attacking the person who was interviewing him. The pivot, attacking opponents or attacking the interview were all tactics of evasion. If you're a journalist, you have to exercise some sort of control over that. And it's particularly difficult in a live interview situation when you don't have the capacity to edit the material, edit out the irrelevant material, as you typically do in print journalism. So how do you deal with that? How do you control the answer through your question? The answer is, what I'm going to talk about right now, is the funnel question or the summary question. And what you do in a funnel question or summary question is that your question has details and facts in context and then proceeds to a specific question in only a few sentences. It's particularly useful in broadcast journalism or in Q&A situations, the Q&A format, question and answer format, where the story will be the verbatim narrative of the interview. And last time I talked about the Q&A format with Oriana Fallaci and how she had to channel and control the interview, knowing that the result would be a transcript. So the funnel question sets up the guidelines for the answer. It channels the answer. And that's the sense that it funnels. It tries to prevent somebody from pivoting, from going off course, from giving irrelevant answers. It includes the facts so that you don't have to debate the facts with somebody. And debating the facts with somebody, particularly in a live broadcast situation, can be kind of counterproductive. It can be boring for the audience unless there's a real drama in that dispute of the facts. So the summary question tries to control the answer by setting up guidelines. It states the facts. It creates the boundaries for the answer. And at the same time, it has the additional function of orienting the audience So now the audience understands the background. Now the audience understands the context. So let me go to 3 progressive examples of a, okay. This is going to be a 3 progressive funnel questions. First one, the premise is that you're interviewing a politician about a municipal budget. And in this scenario, you're not even sure what you know about the budget. So you can ask an open-ended, non-directive question such as, what is the result of the budget? The word result focuses the question, but it's still a general question. It's still wide open. You're not asking for the boring details. When you ask for a result, you're asking for a summary focused on the end result of the budget or the bottom line. And so sometimes that same question is phrased more specifically. What's the bottom line of the budget? Well, the problem with this open-ended, non-directive question is that it gives the person answering the question a lot of latitude, particularly to politicians. It allows the politician to cherry pick what is most favorable about the budget and to downplay what is least favorable about the budget. So tactically, unless you haven't read the budget yet, and you should have read the budget before you ask the question, but tactically, it leaves you wide open. The only advantage is that if you're really alert, you may be able to pick up on follow-up questions. Okay, so that is not a summary question. Okay. So like I say here, the answer to that question might be, the result is our budget is great. There's something in it for everybody. We've done a great job. This is the best budget ever. That's a kind of Donald Trump answer. You know, you ask Donald Trump how, when he was president for 4 years, in the last year in 2020, you asked Donald Trump how the country is doing in terms of the COVID, and he'd say it's great. We're just there's light at the end of the tunnel. We'll be changing soon. By April, it'll be over. That sort of thing. And so that general open-ended question leaves you vulnerable to that answer that a politician or anybody else can simply say everything is great. Now, think of this, the same scenario when using, instead of a non-directive question, a directive question. And we're going to put in this a news value summary question. The news value helps guide us to what has the most important impact on the audience, what the audience should want to know. So a simple narrow directive question with news value would be, where will the biggest impact of the budget be felt by taxpayers and residents? So now you see the question is narrower. The question sets perimeters and ensures that you get the news and not a puffery and self-inflation. It gives you more control, and it makes it harder to pivot away from this, particularly if it's done in broadcast journalism, because the audience can see whether or not the response is evasive or not. But it's also useful in print journalism. It helps you use your time efficiently to get right to the essence of the matters. So a more directive question, and the beginning of the very simple summary question here is, where will the biggest impact of the budget be felt by taxpayers and residents? Okay, so but now we want to develop this as a more thorough funnel question. So we're going to look at the same question, summary question, as more a tightly directive question. It gives facts and contexts. And the facts and context has two functions. One, it sets up the boundaries and focuses the person being interviewed. Two, it lets the audience know what the context is. And this is particularly useful in a broadcast format or Q&A format. Okay, so here we expand that summary question. Council has just passed a $100 million budget with a 5% increase to taxpayers. Okay, we're giving the audience facts. We're setting up boundaries. We're narrowing the question. Second sentence. This is the second year in a row that the council has passed an increase of this amount as it heads towards an election. Okay, we're adding a second factor, and we're adding a tighter boundary. Question: who will be impacted the most by this kind of an increase, and how do you justify that increase to them, particularly in an election year? Well, that's 3 sentences. It's not taking a lot of time. If you're doing it live on broadcast, it doesn't take a lot of time. Even if you were doing it in print journalism, you would still might want to do it this way, because you're using your time. You're still using your time well to get that answer that you need, and the answer is focused on what you want. But we can go even farther. Okay, so here's another type of funnel question. And in this example, say that you're interviewing the Minister of Immigration. So we'll just put in, any name, say whatever the person's name is. And that, of course, has a function. You want to make sure the audience hears the name of the person. So-and-so. As Minister of Immigration, you have said that you would boost the quota for immigrants to Canada substantially. And during the last election campaign, your party said it would loosen the restrictions on the immigration process. The government's own advisory council on economic growth is recommending increased immigration quota figures to help the economy of Canada. But you have just announced the next year that you will keep the quota at 300,000, and you announced increases in the quota for some categories of immigrants at the cost of reducing the number of refugees. That's setting up the question. This is the question, keeping it simple. How is that a fair immigration process, and how does that help the economy? And notice how simple the question is. Remember, if you make the question too complex, the answer can get lost in that complexity, and it also allows the person answering a complex question just to pick one part of the question. Now, this example, you see, it's a much longer summary question. It establishes the facts, it establishes the context and boundaries. It also establishes that you have done your homework and you know the facts, and so there's nowhere to go but to answer the question. The question in itself, coming at the end here, is simple and straightforward. How is that a fair immigration process, and how does it help the economy? I actually took that example from what happened several years ago in Canada. So you see that from this question, when there's a longer question with the summary information at the beginning. However, the question itself is quite simple and straightforward. You've outlined the whole story for the person being interviewed. You've outlined the whole story for the audience. If you're writing a news story, all that you really need now is the answer to your lead. You can make the whole story out of that answer and the follow-up questions. And when you're doing the assignment in this course, you might think of that. Think of what's the one essential question that the story you're writing needs to answer. And remember, I've warned you that what sometimes happens with students is they ask multiple unrelated questions, and then they discover that they can't use all those unrelated answers to make a coherent question. They've asked too many unrelated questions. They'll have to discard the unrelated answers in an effort to make a single coherent narrative. And in discarding that other material, it's sometimes discovered that there's not enough information was gathered and focused for the narrative. That's something you learn with experience. I'm telling you about it now, but you have to go through it and practice it and experience it yourself to really get a sense of what I'm talking about. So you saw in the summary question, the facts are stated. That saves time in the interview. It doesn't bore the audience with taking time to ask questions about facts. You go straight to a speculative question. Is something fair? Okay, that's a speculative question, a wonderful question, because it opens up the whole issue of what is fair and unfair. So with this kind of approach, instead of having to ask multiple questions, if your funnel question is really good, if your summary question is really good, all you have to do in the interview is keep digging with follow-up questions for more precise details, and you can fill in everything during the interview. And with this kind of summary question, there's no confusion with what you want. Sometimes what happens in an interview is the person you're interviewing may be very willing to help you, but the person can't tell from your question what you really want to know. The question actually confuses the person, and you see from the answer that you're not getting the answer you want, and so you have to refine your question. What you're discovering is that you weren't able to cue your source well enough with the question.